It was the spring of 1971 when a new kind of silence settled over the Pacific Ocean, a silence shaped not by nature, but by secrecy. The Cold War had entered its most anxious phase. Above the waterline, diplomacy was a theater of smiles and signatures, yet beneath the surface an invisible conflict unfolded every hour of every day. Deep below, American and Soviet submarines stalked one another through miles of black water, their sonar pings echoing like heartbeats in the dark. Both nations had built networks of listening posts across the ocean floor, yet each still feared what it could not hear. Somewhere within those depths, Moscow's ballistic missile fleet was communicating through armored cables that carried orders, launch codes, and state secrets, and to Washington, those cables were maddeningly silent. Inside the Pentagon's windowless corridors, frustration simmered. Satellite reconnaissance could photograph missile silos and airfields, but the undersea world remained almost mythic, a realm where sound was the only language. The National Security Agency believed that if it could capture Soviet naval communications directly from the source, the United States might finally peer behind the Iron Curtain. Yet the mission they envisioned would require more than technology. It demanded invisibility, audacity, and absolute denial. Even the president, some argued, should be spared the details. The fewer who knew, the safer the secret would remain. Planning began in a secure room at Fort Meade, where a handful of naval engineers met under the banner of environmental research. There were no official minutes, no recorded attendance, only whispered discussions about pressure tolerances, acoustic camouflage, and the physics of underwater current. From those conversations emerged the skeleton of a plan so improbable that it bordered on science fiction. The target lay in the Sea of Okhotsk, a frigid, heavily guarded basin ringed by Soviet territory, legally off-limits to any foreign vessel. Beneath those waters ran a single military cable linking the Pacific Fleet Command at Vladivostok with headquarters in Moscow. To touch it would mean trespassing into the heart of the Soviet Empire. The submarine chosen for this forbidden task was the USS Halibut, a former missile testing platform quietly refitted for covert engineering. Her hull was lined with floodlights, cameras, and manipulator arms designed to operate in crushing darkness. Compartments once used for torpedoes now stored diving equipment and magnetic recorders encased in titanium shells. On paper, the Halibut was conducting routine deep-sea research. In truth, she was preparing to plant the most ambitious listening device ever conceived. The project received an innocuous name, Operation Ivy Bells, a phrase meant to deflect curiosity and reveal nothing. When the Halibut slipped from Pearl Harbor under a moonless sky, only a dozen men aboard understood the full scope of their orders. They would travel more than 3,000 miles into enemy waters, locate a buried Soviet cable using sonar maps and sheer intuition, and attach a pod that could record months of encrypted conversation without discovery. If they failed or were caught, Washington would deny everything, their existence would be erased from naval records. Yet there was no hesitation. Each diver, technician, and officer knew that success would rewrite the balance of power under the sea. As the submarine descended through layers of cold water, sunlight faded from the periscope until the world narrowed to the dull red glow of control panels. The hull creaked under pressure, the air grew heavy with oil and metal, and the men moved with quiet precision born of training and fear. Above them, the Pacific stretched unbroken to the horizon. Below, a darkness older than war waited. In that silence, the Halibut became something more than a vessel. It became a secret, sealed within steel, carrying ears that would soon press themselves against the arteries of a rival superpower. And while politicians debated treaties and détente on the surface, deep beneath the waves a new front of espionage had already begun, one so secret that even the President of the United States would not be told it existed. The early 1970s were an age defined by nerves, a world balanced on codes, silence, and suspicion. The Cuban Missile Crisis was less than a decade behind, and though the world had stepped back from the edge of annihilation, the shadow it cast was long and cold. Every whisper of radar static, every unknown blip on sonar, could be interpreted as the start of Armageddon. In Washington, that fear had hardened into strategy. In Moscow, it had become a way of life. Both sides built arsenals meant not just to fight a war, but to convince the other that fighting would mean the end of civilization itself. Beneath this fragile balance, intelligence was everything. Knowledge of where the enemy's submarines prowled, how often they transmitted, and what orders they followed could determine the fate of continents. The Soviets guarded their naval communications with almost religious devotion, burying cables under layers of silt, shielding transmitters, and encrypting every syllable of radio traffic. To them, the sea was both sanctuary and fortress, a place where no foreign signal could penetrate. The Americans, in turn, began to see the ocean as a new battlefield, one where the smallest vibration might reveal a nation's most guarded secret. Inside the National Security Agency, paranoia evolved into policy. Cryptographers, engineers, and naval officers worked in parallel worlds, each aware of only a fraction of the whole. Those who designed the recording devices never met the divers who would install them. Those who analyzed the intercepted data never saw the submarine that risked capture to obtain it. Compartmentalization was not just security, it was doctrine. If one layer failed, the others could still deny everything. It was espionage built like an onion, each truth wrapped within another lie. Yet secrecy breeds its own dangers. By excluding oversight, the operation gained freedom and lost restraint. There was no congressional approval, no presidential signature, and no paper trail beyond a handful of code names. Within that vacuum, the Navy and the NSA formed an alliance that answered only to itself. Officially, they called it acoustic research. In private, some officers joked that it was the birth of a shadow navy, one that operated below the waves and beyond the law. The deeper the planners went, the more audacious their ideas became. They proposed permanent listening stations on the seabed, disguised as geological sensors, remote-controlled vehicles capable of trailing Soviet submarines for weeks, and fiber-optic transmitters so small they could be hidden inside coral. Every design session ended with the same unspoken question: if the Soviets discovered one of these devices, would they see it as espionage or as an act of war? The answer was uncertain, and yet the work continued, driven by a quiet conviction that information itself was worth the risk of catastrophe. In Moscow, intelligence analysts began to suspect something. Submarines reported faint sonar echoes near the Kuril Trench. Patrol aircraft sighted foreign periscopes in forbidden zones. The Soviet Navy increased its drills, tightened its patrol routes, and ordered new acoustic mines to be deployed along the coast. But no one could say exactly what the Americans were after. To the Kremlin, it was just another ghost story, one more reminder that the enemy was always listening, even when there was nothing to hear. In this atmosphere of mutual suspicion, Operation Ivy Bells took on a mythic quality. It was no longer just an intelligence mission, it was a symbol of how far both empires were willing to go to protect their secrets. The Cold War was no longer fought only in the skies or the corridors of power, but in the quiet black corridors of the deep ocean. And down there, where pressure-crushed steel and light could not reach, paranoia itself became the most powerful weapon of all. By the time Operation Ivy Bells entered its final planning stage, the line between official sanction and rogue initiative had blurred completely. The operation lived in a twilight zone of authority, known to a handful of admirals, a few senior figures in the NSA, and almost no one else. It had not passed through the National Security Council, and the Oval Office had never received a briefing. There was no formal presidential signature, no clear legal framework, only a chain of verbal approvals that began and ended in classified corridors. To those involved, this absence of oversight was not a flaw but a shield. The mission was too valuable to risk through politics, and too delicate to survive the scrutiny of diplomats. Secrecy, at last, had become its own justification. The men who designed the operation believed they were working for history itself. They saw themselves not as spies, but as custodians of national survival. At the height of the Cold War, information was as decisive as firepower, perhaps even more so. Every intercepted message, every decoded line of data could prevent a miscalculation that might turn fear into nuclear war. And so, the deeper the secrecy, the stronger the belief that their actions were righteous. To them, the moral equation was simple: knowledge could save the world, even if it was obtained in silence and shadows. The submarine USS Halibut was fitted with new systems that pushed the limits of naval engineering. Her hull carried massive sonar arrays, deep-sea cameras, and an unmarked capsule designed to house a recording pod the size of a small car. The device itself was a masterpiece of analog ingenuity, a titanium cylinder lined with magnetic reels and protected against crushing pressure by reinforced steel. It would record every conversation traveling through the Soviet undersea cable, translating whispers from Moscow into electrical signals captured in absolute secrecy. Once attached, the pod could run for months without maintenance, storing hundreds of hours of encrypted Soviet communications that would later be retrieved, analyzed, and decrypted in the labs of Fort Meade. Every element of the mission required precision beyond the margin of error. The Sea of Okhotsk was a graveyard for foreign vessels, surrounded by Soviet territory and patrolled by anti-submarine aircraft. The water was shallow near the coast but dropped suddenly into a trench more than 10,000 feet deep. The cable itself lay somewhere along that slope, buried under layers of sediment, invisible even to sonar. To locate it, Halibut's crew used classified bathymetric maps and fragments of intercepted Soviet data, piecing together what little they knew into a probable search grid. Failure meant discovery, and discovery meant war. During the final briefing, the officers gathered in a compartment lit only by red lamps. Their commanding officer, a man chosen as much for his composure as his technical skill, outlined the plan in a voice steady but grave. "We are going where no one has gone before," he said quietly. "There will be no backup, no extraction, no headlines. If we succeed, the world will never know. If we fail, the world may not survive." No one spoke after that. There was nothing to add. When Halibut set course towards Soviet waters, she carried more than machinery, she carried an idea. The idea that in a world divided by fear, truth itself had to be stolen, not shared. Beneath her steel decks, sailors slept beside devices whose existence could never be admitted. And far above them, in the marble halls of power, even the President of the United States remained unaware that his navy was about to trespass into the heart of an empire. It was an operation without authorization, without precedent, and without mercy, a mission built entirely on faith that no one, anywhere, would ever find out. The USS Halibut crossed into the Sea of Okhotsk under a canopy of fog, her black hull sliding through the waves without a trace. Above, the sky was iron gray, the wind sharp and cold enough to sting bare skin. Below, the water thickened into a blue-green darkness that swallowed light within minutes. To the men aboard, the ocean was no longer a place, it was an element of pressure and time. Every descent, every turn of the propeller, brought them closer to the invisible boundary that separated observation from intrusion. The crew knew that once they crossed that line, they would be operating inside the Soviet Union itself. Inside the control room, the atmosphere was tense but methodical. The red glow of instrument panels painted faces in shades of blood and shadow. Every movement had been rehearsed 100 times, every order was given in a whisper. The halibut sonar array swept the seabed in long, rhythmic arcs, searching for the faint metallic echo of the buried cable. Engineers monitored pressure gauges, trim levels, and the faint hum of the reactor, noting every vibration that didn't belong. Each sound was a possible threat, a Soviet destroyer, a drifting mine, or a patrol submarine listening for strangers in its waters. At a depth of nearly 400 feet, the hull began to creak under strain. The noise was low and groaning, like the slow bending of old wood. Some men glanced upward instinctively, knowing there was no way back if the steel failed. They were alone in a region so isolated that even Soviet fishermen rarely ventured here. The nearest friendly base was thousands of miles away. In those conditions, fear was natural, but fear had to be managed. The divers called it the silent sickness, the moment when you realized the ocean didn't care whether you lived or died. In the cramped diving compartment, 2 men prepared for the most dangerous part of the mission. They wore thick neoprene suits layered beneath heavy gear, oxygen tanks strapped tight, communication lines checked twice. The chamber was dim, lit only by a single overhead lamp that swayed gently with the motion of the sea. The air smelled of oil, salt, and anticipation. One diver made a nervous joke about fishing in enemy waters. No one laughed. The order came through the intercom: flood the chamber. Water hissed through the vents, rising quickly from their boots to their waists, then their shoulders. Within seconds, it reached the ceiling, and the outer hatch opened into darkness. They swam into a world that belonged to pressure and silence. Visibility was measured in inches, the beam of their lamp scattering into a pale haze. Their guide rope was the only link to the submarine, a thin white lifeline against the black. On the seafloor, the sand rippled like fabric, disturbed by the faint current. And there, half buried beneath silt and kelp, they saw it, the cable. It was thicker than either of them expected, armored in layers of steel and copper, pulsing faintly with the energy of distant voices. This was the artery of the Soviet Navy, the line that carried secrets between Moscow and its fleet. Back inside the halibut, the recording pod was prepared for deployment. Engineers checked seals and voltage levels, then lowered the titanium cylinder through a narrow hatch. Its descent was slow, precise, and silent. The divers guided it toward the cable, securing clamps that locked with a dull click audible even through their suits. One of them looked up toward the vague shape of the submarine above, then gave a small signal with his glove, the mission's first and only handshake with success. When the pod was finally anchored in place, the divers drifted for a moment, looking at their work. The cable stretched away into darkness in both directions, vanishing into the unknown. In that instant, they had done the unthinkable, tapped the heartbeat of an empire. The return to the halibut was quiet, almost reverent. As the hatch sealed and the chamber drained, the first faint pulses of Soviet communication began to flow into the American recorder. Above them, the sea kept its secret. Below them, the machine began to listen. For weeks, the USS Halibut lingered in the grey emptiness of the Sea of Okhotsk, motionless except for the slow hum of her systems. Above, the surface was calm and deceptive, a mirror of slate that concealed the world's most daring act of espionage. Beneath that stillness, the submarine's recording pod worked in utter silence, drinking in the secret language of an empire. Through miles of armored cable, the voices of Soviet admirals, engineers, and radio operators pulsed like electric ghosts, captured on magnetic tape deep inside a titanium shell no larger than a family car. Every vibration, every encoded phrase, was history in the making, data so sensitive that no sheet of paper would ever bear its summary. Inside the submarine, time lost its meaning. The crew followed a strict routine of watches and rest periods, but the outside world had ceased to exist. They were a crew of shadows, existing in a place between nations, forbidden to speak of their mission even to their families. Only a handful of men, the commanding officer, the chief engineer, and a pair of NSA specialists, understood what the recorder below was truly capturing. They listened through low-volume headsets, filtering the static, hearing the fragments of distant orders. Sometimes a Russian voice, flat and official, would break through the hum of the sea. At other times there was only coded chatter, bursts of encrypted numbers that sounded more like music than speech. Every few months, the halibut would return to the site. Divers would descend once more into the black, guided by instinct and a map of memory. They replaced the tapes, inspected the seals, and verified that no Soviet trawler or patrol had discovered the pod. The recovered reels were stored in padded containers, then flown under guard to Fort Meade, Maryland, where analysts in windowless rooms began the painstaking work of decoding. It was a new form of warfare, patient, invisible, and measured in inches instead of miles. The intelligence they produced was extraordinary. Transcripts revealed not only fleet positions and patrol schedules but also glimpses into Soviet command philosophy. American analysts learned how Moscow rotated its submarines, how orders were phrased, how launch protocols were rehearsed. They discovered that many Soviet captains feared their own command as much as the enemy, punished for any deviation from routine. It was as if the NSA had tapped directly into the psychology of an entire navy. For strategists in Washington, this was a revelation. For the men who had risked their lives to obtain it, it was vindication. Each successful retrieval deepened the illusion of invincibility. The operation seemed untouchable, as if the sea itself conspired to keep it hidden. Confidence grew, and with it came the quiet arrogance that all secrets eventually breed. The NSA began planning to expand the system, to place additional pods along other Soviet cables, perhaps even in the Barents Sea near Murmansk. The Navy dreamed of an underwater network that could listen to the world. Every new mission pushed the boundary of legality and sanity a little further. The project's code name remained deliberately meaningless, its files sealed inside safes that few could open. Only a small circle of men understood that they were conducting what amounted to a private war beneath the waves, a war fought with microphones instead of missiles. Yet in the silence of that triumph, something fragile had begun to form, a dependency on secrecy so absolute that it blinded its creators. The operation was now too successful, too valuable, and far too invisible to stop. It had been built to outwit the Soviets, but it was also outpacing its own oversight. Every success deepened the shadow around it. And somewhere in that shadow, beyond the reach of radar and law, lay the first faint hint of betrayal, the quiet beginning of the disaster no one yet saw coming. By the late 1970s, Operation Ivy Bells had become a legend whispered only in the most secure rooms of American intelligence. Its success was intoxicating, the recordings flawless, the Soviets still unaware that their most sacred communications flowed through an American ear. But success has a way of breeding complacency, and complacency invites danger. The pod on the seafloor continued to hum faithfully, month after month, while on land, a man no one suspected was quietly preparing to destroy everything it had achieved. His name was Ronald Pelton, a former analyst at the National Security Agency. By the time he was 37, Pelton was drowning in debt, frustrated by career stagnation, and bitter over what he saw as the agency's indifference to his loyalty. He resigned in 1979 with little ceremony and less savings. But in leaving, he carried something far more valuable than classified documents. He carried memory. Pelton possessed a near-photographic recall of sensitive operations, and among them was the one project so secret that only a handful of men were cleared to even say its name, Ivy Bells. Desperation and greed drove him toward betrayal. In January 1980, under the dull winter lights of Vienna, Pelton walked into the Soviet embassy and offered what few traitors could, the location of a hidden American miracle. For a modest payment and the promise of protection, he revealed that deep within the Sea of Okhotsk, the United States had placed a recording pod directly on a Soviet military cable. He described the submarine used, the type of divers trained for the mission, even the configuration of the titanium housing that held the tapes. The KGB officer who met him that day barely reacted, masking the enormity of what he'd just learned. But when the report reached Moscow, it detonated like a silent bomb inside the walls of the Lubyanka. Within weeks, the Soviet Navy began an urgent operation of its own. Under the guise of routine maintenance, they dispatched a specialized vessel to the coordinates Pelton had described. The ship lowered submersible probes into the depths, and before long, the cameras found it, a small, cylindrical object clamped to the cable, faintly corroded by salt and time. The divers removed it carefully, almost reverently, and brought it to the surface. What they found inside confirmed every fear. The Americans had been listening for years. Every command, every exercise, every secret thought of their fleet had been captured and studied by their greatest rival. The discovery triggered shock and fury at the highest levels of the Kremlin. Orders were issued to inspect every communication line across the Soviet Union's maritime frontier. Mines were deployed, patrols increased, and for months the seas were thick with suspicion. The Americans, meanwhile, were oblivious. The NSA continued to process old recordings, unaware that the pod had been recovered and that its existence was now one of Moscow's most guarded secrets. Pelton's betrayal remained hidden for years. The Soviets protected him, using his knowledge to adjust tactics and disguise new signals. To them, he was a weapon, a man who had traded patriotism for survival. But secrets have weight, and eventually, they crush those who carry them. When Pelton was finally arrested in 1985, he confessed everything with the weary calm of someone who no longer recognized the line between truth and treason. The fallout was devastating. The Ivy Bells project was shut down, its files sealed under new layers of classification. Every ship and submarine involved was reassigned, every record purged of identifiers. The ocean floor that once carried a whisper of victory now held only silence. What had begun as the most daring covert operation in naval history ended not with discovery at sea, but with a single man's voice in a Soviet embassy, the sound of loyalty breaking in half. When the truth finally reached Washington, it did not come as a thunderclap but as a slow, suffocating realization. The CIA's counterintelligence division had intercepted reports that something catastrophic had happened in the Sea of Okhotsk. The Soviets had discovered the cable tap. There were no photographs, no radio intercepts, just whispers filtering through diplomatic back channels and the faint shift in Soviet naval patterns. Patrols had doubled, underwater mines had been deployed, and the once silent Okhotsk basin now buzzed with activity. For the men who had built Ivy Bells, it was the sound of a secret dying. Inside the NSA, emergency meetings were held behind locked doors. Directors demanded answers no one wanted to give. How long had the Soviets known? Had the traitor been identified? Were there other breaches? Files were pulled from safes, access logs reviewed, names quietly erased. Even among the highest ranks, the atmosphere was one of disbelief. Ivy Bells had operated flawlessly for years. It was supposed to be invisible. The idea that Moscow had not only discovered the pod but recovered it intact was unthinkable. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The flow of intelligence had gone silent. The last recorded Soviet transmission on the tapes ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if someone had literally cut the wire. Damage control became the only mission. The Navy moved swiftly to sanitize all traces of the operation. Ship manifests were rewritten, maintenance logs retyped, mission reports quietly reclassified or destroyed. Crew members who had served aboard the Halibut were reassigned under new cover designations, warned never to speak of their deployments. The few surviving engineers who had designed the pod received personal visits from counterintelligence officers reminding them of their lifelong oaths of silence. The CIA drafted a fallback narrative describing the entire project as experimental acoustic research. It was a phrase that appeared in just 3 official memos and nowhere else. In public, there was nothing to deny, because there was nothing to admit. The president was briefed only after the fact, handed a summary so vague it bordered on fiction. He asked how something so vast could have existed without his knowledge. The answer was a single line spoken by an admiral who had helped authorize it years before. Sometimes, Mr. President, the less you know, the safer we all are. It was not meant as defiance, only practicality. The machinery of secrecy had been running for so long that even the commander-in-chief could only glimpse its shadows. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the discovery of the cable tap became a state secret of its own. The KGB circulated limited internal reports, warning naval officers that foreign powers had penetrated Soviet waters. Publicly, nothing was said. There were no press statements, no diplomatic protests. The Kremlin understood that to admit such a violation would be to expose its own vulnerability. Silence served both sides. America could pretend it had never trespassed, and the Soviet Union could pretend it had never been deceived. Yet beneath that mutual silence, something fundamental had changed. The era of undersea innocence was over. The Soviets began developing their own deep-sea surveillance systems, deploying traps and decoys where the Americans had once listened. In turn, U.S. intelligence redirected its focus towards satellites and space-based reconnaissance, where the risk of discovery was lower but the distance from truth even greater. The ocean, once a frontier of bold espionage, had become too dangerous to touch. For the veterans of Ivy Bells, the revelation was a quiet heartbreak. They had believed they were serving history, protecting peace through knowledge. Now they watched as the operation vanished behind layers of denial, reduced to rumors and footnotes. Their medals were classified, their stories erased, their legacy buried under the same waters where it had been born. Officially, Ivy Bells had never existed. Unofficially, it had changed the course of submarine warfare forever, and proven that even in victory, secrecy always demands a price. In the decades that followed, the story of Operation Ivy Bells faded into the undertow of history, a classified echo buried beneath layers of silence and denial. To the few who had known it existed, it remained both a source of pride and quiet shame. Pride, for what had been achieved, a triumph of engineering, courage, and ingenuity that had once allowed America to listen directly to its greatest rival. Shame, for how it had ended, exposed, betrayed, and erased by the very secrecy that had made it possible. What began as a mission to understand the enemy had become a lesson in the limits of trust, both abroad and within. By the 1980s, the oceans themselves had changed. Satellites now watched from above, and the digital age was replacing the analog whispers of copper cables. The era of submarines creeping through hostile waters to plant recorders on the seabed seemed almost primitive, a relic of a time when espionage required physical courage and human risk. Yet the principles that drove Ivy Bell's surveillance without consent, knowledge above law, secrecy above truth, never disappeared. They evolved. The same logic that once justified wiretapping the Soviet Navy would one day justify tapping fiber optic lines, intercepting internet traffic, and listening not to admirals but to entire nations. The sea was no longer the only frontier of silence. Now the silence existed in the airwaves, in the invisible space between satellites and screens. For those who lived it, the memories persisted in fragments. A diver who had touched the Soviet cable remembered how it vibrated faintly in his glove, as though alive. An engineer recalled the whirring sound of the recorder's reel spinning in the dark, the first heartbeat of espionage captured in metal. And somewhere, an analyst at Fort Meade could still hear the ghost of a Russian voice from decades before, formal, calm, unaware that it was being heard by another world. These were the human traces of an operation never meant to leave any. When Ivy Bell's was finally declassified in part, years after the Soviet Union had dissolved, historians were astonished by its audacity. It was engineering on the edge of possibility, executed with precision under conditions that bordered on suicidal. Yet what struck many most was not the danger or the brilliance, but the blindness, the fact that the United States government had run a military operation in enemy territory without the knowledge of its own president. In the name of national security, an empire of secrecy had built itself, layer by layer, until it no longer answered to those who were supposed to command it. That realization haunted the intelligence community long after the tapes stopped spinning. Today, the site of the cable tap lies quiet. The Sea of Okhotsk is still and grey, its waters hiding the scars of a war that never officially happened. Rusted fragments of titanium may still rest on the seafloor, half buried in silt, the bones of a secret that outlived its makers. The world above has moved on, but the questions remain: how much should a government hide in the name of safety? How much can a nation know before it loses sight of itself? In the end, Operation Ivy Bell's was more than an act of espionage. It was a reflection of an era when fear became reason and silence became strength. It proved that the greatest power in war is not always a weapon, but a secret, one so deep that even the president is left in the dark.